Hey friends, great to be with you with this first lecture. As I mentioned in the introduction, we're really taking a turn here to still thinking about youth ministry, but we're trying to think it through these organizational frames. And so what I want to do is give you sort of an overview of maybe how an organization sort of lives and dies. And then also talk about these organizational frames, because I think when we understand the environments by which we work, it gives us a new appreciation of the types of conversations that we have in the work that we need to do. We cannot do youth ministry in like a lane. We cannot do it in a bubble. We cannot do it thinking that we can just kind of do our things and we can kind of let the world around us go. You've probably noticed this in a lot of what I've talked about already, that there are just forces at play that leaders need to be aware of. Sometimes we can do something about them, but sometimes we just have to be aware of them. And so I think this is where these organizational frames can be really, really helpful. But for starters, I want to talk about this idea of what it looks like to navigate an organization. And what really is interesting is we can think about sort of a cycle of an organization. There actually are cycles and sort of a way of life that an organization goes through. And you are not going to be surprised by this. You're probably experiencing it in some sort of way. So an organization often starts out like a startup, okay? It's very individualistic, it's very entrepreneurial, it's very informal. This is kind of where the rebels hang out. They decide, instead of asking the question why, they ask the question why not? And they launch off to try something new, different. They want to be responsive to what they see as a need in the world or a pain in the world that they want to do something about. So startups are the ones that kind of launch into that. What eventually happens with an organization, it moves to the sense of growth. This is where all of a sudden you have sort of this charismatic, collective, mostly informal and creative types that are still feeling the informalness of the startup, but they're beginning to get some momentum. They're seeing growth. They're seeing opportunity, and this is really where the adapters are. They're the ones that are constantly changing and reimagining some things, kind of riding the enthusiasm of a new organization and trying to step into that space. It's a very exciting space, of course. And eventually, an organization gets to a plateau. This is where formalized models are needed. This is where perhaps the organization is growing, or there's a rhythm, or you realize that an organization can't do everything, that even in a startup or in the growth space, all of a sudden you get to that point where you have to decide, okay, so what are we really about? What are we really choosing to focus on all the things that we're doing and the way that we're doing it? What are the approaches, values, priorities, systems that we're beginning to set up in order for that to happen? And so a lot of times this is where the experts are brought in to help an organization get better at a few things that they really feel like they're being called to. And so there's a formalization that comes with this and a bit of a focus that's there in the plateau. What can happen is that organization can get to this point of decline. This is where all of a sudden you begin to see that perhaps some of the energy or momentum is beginning to be lost. So we move into a preserving sort of realm where there's new ideas, but a lot of the same assumptions. Okay, so this is when we go back to sort of the single and double loop learning. We kind of get caught in the single loop learning, right? Well, what did we do last time? We've always done it this way. This worked before, let's do it again. And so the assumptions in the view oftentimes get caught here where that happens. Now, here's where you have managers. That's where a lot of leaders are in sort of this stage. Managers aren't bad. They're managing the organization. They're trying to keep it going. They tend to be able to hold people together and do pretty well with the systems that have been given to them, but they're not necessarily the ones that are sort of breaking out of the system and thinking of new ways to think about that. And then an organization can get to this dying space. This is where all of a sudden you're kind of lost in the sense of nostalgia or old school. The organization remembers of what they used to be and in many ways hold on to that, and they're trying desperately to not die. Now, I think in youth ministry, we can think about this in a lot of ways, right? Like young churches love the idea of young people in their church, but what they want for young people is oftentimes quite nostalgic. If we can just get young people back, we can get back to the heydays of when we were all about young people, right? And there's also something about with this nostalgia, which I think is interesting, is sometimes as organizations and as communities, we tell ourselves certain narratives about who we are. So like I've talked with a lot of different churches, they're like, oh my gosh, we're a missionary church, we're a sending church. And I'm like, oh, well, tell me about who you're sending or supporting. And they'll be like, well, right now we have like 2 missionaries or whatever. Now, there's nothing wrong with having 2 missionaries. But I think what's interesting is that there was probably a time in their organization where they probably had 20 missionaries that they were sending out, and they're still telling themselves that they are a missionary church or a missionary organization. But the fact of the matter is that they're sort of looking back at a heyday rather than where they are now. I think that can be true with youth ministry as well. We're a young, vibrant church. We care about young people. And, I remember back in the day when we used to have like tons of kids here because we'd have like bands or like these crazy games and everybody would want to be part of it. So we're really a young people church until you see where they're at now and you realize that perhaps the way that the church is set up is not possible for that anymore. So we can kind of get caught in that as well. Now, a cycle of an organization is a cycle of an organization. Some go through this and some actually die. And let me just be honest with you. I don't think there's necessarily anything wrong with an organization dying. I think that sometimes we can celebrate the contribution that an organization has made in a particular space and time. But there are times where perhaps that organization needs to kind of close its doors and make space and room for others to step into that. It doesn't mean that they're bad. It doesn't mean that they never did anything good. It just means that at some point, perhaps they've run out of their mission and it's actually time to actually close the doors. Now, I think a healthy organization doesn't need to die. I think that when we get through the plateau, an organization has an opportunity and a challenge. The opportunity is that they can think about new growth edges and actually instead of coming over that bend and going decline, they can actually have a new growth spurt and continue to grow. But that requires something unique of the organization to think again charismatically, collectively, and adapt to their environment. Those that don't will move toward decline and run the risk of dying. So I think we see this a lot with our organizations and ways to think about it. And perhaps you could think about your church or your organization and where they might be at in this particular place. Now, when it comes to youth ministry, I think we could put this arc on youth ministries as well. I think that youth ministry mentalities have sort of different ways of thinking. So there are some I talk with all types of colleagues, okay, and all types of people that are thinking about youth ministry. And I think they all fall in these categories, right? You have the startup youth ministry thinkers, right? Like they're just like, what if we blow the whole thing up and start over again? Like, what if we just like totally changed our assumptions and started over again? There are people out there that are thinking that way. And I think we almost need that in some ways. I mean, I think youth ministry was birthed out of this idea of like, yeah, why not? Like nothing's working. How do we reach young people, right? And so I think there's a spirit of that in youth ministry. I think there's places where we ask the question about growth, like who are the people or models connecting with young people today? We at FYI, we actually have a team that's looking for sort of the Wakanda models. Okay, if you think about the movie, right? Like this idea that like where are the ministries that are doing really cool things, but they're hidden in plain sight. They don't make the radar of like the typical things that we think about with youth ministry, because sometimes there are parameters or assumptions made about what's legit or what's not. But there are some amazing and beautiful and inspiring youth ministry expressions that are sort of off the radar, but are actually the ones that we want to pay attention to. That's pretty cool. So we're sort of thinking about that and trying to ask those questions. I think there's plateaus. How do we improve models or get or not lose more young people? As a matter of fact, you probably have these conversations with a lot of people in your leaders, right? In your leadership, right? Like, how do we keep young people around? How do we think about retention and all that comes with that? These are important questions. They're not bad or wrong, but this is more of like a plateau thinking than thinking innovatively. And in some ways, that's not all bad. I mean, we come from communities that have tremendous resource. And so sometimes it's about reimagining and thinking about the resources that we have, right? I just had a conversation with leaders this last week about that. Like, you don't have to blow the whole thing up, but you have to think about the resources that you have. And I think that can be really important. I think there can be decline where you have people that are asking, how do we get young people to see that our models are important, right? So this is where I think we get the question of, how do we get them back into our services? How do we get them back into our youth ministry programming, right? This turns into a question of almost desperation, where we're losing them and we need to get them back into the systems that we already have established. We're not looking for new systems. We just want to get young people to like our system. So we maybe change a few things, but there's not a lot of change. And then there's dying. Today's young people don't care. So how do we catch the next younger generation? I think we're in a really interesting place with this right now. Okay. So, and you're reading Twenge's Generations, right? Like, think about this. Like, in some ways, if I could be really crass, we've kind of written off the millennials, and now we're on to Gen Z, and some people are already writing off Gen Z, and they're on the way to, Gen Alpha. Why? Well, I think there's some ways of a dying organization or movement refuses to change themselves, so they almost, and it's not necessarily like ill intent. There's no ill intent, but just think about this for a second. We've kind of said, well, we missed it with that generation. Let's look at the next one, right? That there's something about that is just really disturbing to me. But we kind of hear this in popular culture, or even in some conversations that we have with youth ministry, which I think we need to think about. Okay, so what does this all mean? Well, I think we could just ask the question, well, where is youth ministry? From your vantage point, where do you think youth ministry falls in this growth circle? We can think about that in a meta form. And at FYI, I think we're trying to think about that a lot. Like, where are we? And when we get together, perhaps for our session with Steve and Rachel, maybe we can talk about that. I'd love to have that conversation with all of you. But I'm wondering about, in your own youth ministry context, whatever that organization is, or college ministry, or whatever you're doing, like, where do you think you fall in that? Because I think what you will find is that it's more than just your opinion. I think I would listen for the questions your organization is asking about young people. That will give you an indicator of where you're at in this arc, and maybe evoke some of the ways to think about how you might negotiate that as you think about what it means to advocate for young people. So I wanted to give you that arc. I think it's really interesting. I think you could take it to your team and kind of say, hey, y'all, where do you think we are at? Because I think it evokes some different conversations about what it means to be innovative, about what it means to change, about what it means to advocate for young people, and where the mentality is of the community that you're working with is actually at. Hope that's helpful. We'll see you soon.